do have, I think, about half of the books that we'll be studying in the next series of studies on the front pew. We're expecting another half shipment of those. They haven't arrived yet. Yes, it is. I guess we're fortunate to have what we have. But nonetheless, if you find that there's not one available when you come up here to the front pew to get one, then those others should be here by Wednesday evening. And hopefully, we'll start the new year in that new book if things go well. We'll see how the speaker does at getting us through the material. Genesis chapter 35. We're going to start in verse 16 here in just a little bit, talking about Jacob and his family. But before we get into that, let's talk just a little bit about what has led us up to this point. Where is Jacob? Let's see. How should I put this? Maybe geographically, and how did he get there? And somebody tell us a little bit about that. Is he in Canaan? Is he in Aram? Where is he?
Hebron.
Okay. Hebron. Okay.
Bethel.
All right. Bethel. Okay. And so we see, and I understand that this is not the best map, but let me just kind of walk you through that. Up here at the top, this is an arrow that's pointing to and away from Haran in Syria, or Aram, Padan Aram. And how did Jacob get up there? What occurred that caused him to get up there, Ken?
By the way, I did mean to say that's all part of the
Okay.
But he got up there because he was trying to escape his brother, who was kind of
All right. So Esau was going to kill him. At least they thought, and Esau had said that he was going to do that, and so Rebekah sends him up there to who?
Laban.
Family. Okay, it was Jacob's uncle and Rebekah's brother, right? Okay, so he spent how many years in Padan Aram? 20, right. And built a family while he was there, didn't he? And so he received, for those 20 years, he came back with 2 wives, right? And 11 sons and a daughter. And a great number of flocks. And so God told him it was time for him to leave, and so he left Laban, and we talked about how that he just kind of, while Laban was away. And so he came back into the hill country of Gilead. He met with Laban. Laban came and caught him, and they had a discussion about why he left, and Laban's missing the teraphim and all of these things. And so after that period of time, he comes to Mahanaim. And at this point in time, he realizes, and maybe even just before that, he realizes that his brother Esau is on the way. And so he sends out emissaries and gifts to Esau, right? And so then they meet, and what happened upon that meeting? They made up. Yeah, that's right. Esau, when he saw him, got close enough to Jacob, he came running, and the scripture says he fell on his neck and kissed him, so that, he embraced him and hugged him, and they were glad to see one another, and Jacob was greatly relieved, obviously. But before that, there was something that happened there at Peniel, and what was that? What happened?
He wrestled with the angel.
Okay, he wrestled with an angel there. And that was the same night that he had just previously taken his family and had crossed them over the Jabbok River there to the place near Succoth. And these two lines right here, really, we know that Esau did eventually live in Edom and Mount Seir, but Jacob really never went there. And from what we learn in our study in chapter 36 is that, we'll talk about this morning, Lord willing, is that Esau really lived a little bit closer to Canaan and actually dwelt in Canaan for a period of time while Jacob was there. And then Esau decided to go down to Edom and make his permanent dwelling place there because of various factors. And I don't want to give away too much of the story, but you know what I'm talking about. Succoth means what?
Booths.
Booths, that's right. And so he built booths, or he built stalls for his cattle there. He also built a house there, didn't he? And so he is still not where he wants to be. Where does he eventually want to wind up? Okay, in Hebron, or Mamre, or the Oaks of Mamre, all those names refer to the same place. The purpose for going to Hebron is what? Who's in Hebron? Isaac is, that's right. And so he wants to go back and see his father before he dies. And so that's what we're going to learn about. He lives in Succoth for a period of time, and then they go over to Shechem, and this is the place where what happened? I heard somebody say, but I can't. Okay, where Dinah was defiled, and Shechem, and then it came down to Bethel and stayed for a period of time, and on the way from Bethel to, we actually have two deaths that we talk about, and we are going to get into that this morning. One of them I don't have on the PowerPoint. We'll just have to refer to that as we go through. And so eventually he gets down to Hebron where Isaac is. And so that kind of brings us down to that point in time where Jacob is made. And so when, just from the chronological standpoint, let's look at page 99. Well, really page 98, I guess, because we'll get into 99 in a minute. That chronology note on page 98, it says the episode with Dinah and Shechem helps us establish a time frame of this period. Joseph was approximately 6 years old when Jacob left Haran. And we gained that information by the fact that Rachel, Jacob, after he had worked 7 years, right, for Rachel, and then he actually got Leah. And at the end of that 7-year period of time, he realized that he had been given Leah instead of Rachel, and so he raised that issue with Laban, and Laban went ahead and gave him Rachel. And then he worked 7 years for her and 6 years for the cattle. So somewhere between the age of 6 and maybe even as much as 13, when Jacob leaves Canaan, is the age of Joseph. Maybe closer to 6. That's Jacob was not born until after the 14-year period. And so he left Haran, and Jacob finally settles there in the land of Canaan, and his son Joseph, as we'll learn, is sold into slavery at the age of 17. And so that means there were about 11 years spent at Succoth, Shechem, Bethel, and then at Hebron before Joseph was sold. Jacob built a house at Succoth, and he bought land at Shechem, but we do not know how long he lived in either place or how long he lived at Shechem before the defilement of Dinah. We do know that by the time he gets to Shechem and Dinah is defiled, then he has sons that are young men. and Judah would have been young men by that time. It's apparent that at least, as he mentions here, some of those grown young men by now, they would not have been grown for a few years after returning to Canaan, since even Reuben, the oldest, would have been only about 12 years old at the time of Jacob's meeting with Esau. Now, that is a little bit iffy as far as the 12 years are concerned, because we know that there were at least 11 years after he worked the 7. Let's see, let me get this right. He worked the 7, then he worked 13 others, right, to get what he got. So it very well could have been that Reuben, was a year or two older than that. We don't know for sure. But that gives us kind of an idea of how old he was and the situation there. Now, as we get over to our text today, Genesis chapter 35, we're going to start with verse 16, that we find Jacob, we find Jacob and his family at Bethel. And so Jacob and his family traveled from Bethel, which was also called Luz, toward Ephrath, which was later called Bethlehem. And Rachel has who? What child? Joseph. Okay, and so now the second child is about to be born, and the nurse tells her, "Don't worry, you have another son." Yeah, you have another son. And so it comes about that Rachel dies as a result of childbirth, and as she brought forth the son, she called his name, and she named him Benoni, which means son of my sorrow. Jacob, we don't know if he was right there at the birth or not, but he was somewhere else, whatever. When he arrived at Rachel's side, he said, "No, we're going to call him Benjamin," which is son of the right hand. And so why would he change the name?
First one was pretty negative.
Okay, it was, yeah. I mean, Rachel's is ending the throes of childbirth, and then she's actually fading away. And she's in sorrow because she'll not see her son. She'll not see him grow up. Yet Jacob comes and says, he's the son of my right hand, because here my beloved wife, my favorite of all, has brought forth this son. And I think it's a great and wonderful thing. And so he renames his son Benjamin, son of the right hand. So no doubt a very sad situation with Jacob losing his wife. But nonetheless, he does have another son by her. And so instead of burying her in the cave of Machpelah, where all the other ancestors were buried, he buries her there on the way to Ephrath, between Hebron and Ephrath, or Bethlehem, because they had not made it, to where, down to Hebron yet. Did I say Hebron? What did I mean to say? Let me go back to our slide. Between Bethel and Ephrath, yeah. Get it right here in a minute. Okay, so she's buried between Bethel and Ephrath, and the grave was marked, and the location was known up until the time when Moses wrote the book of Genesis, which would have been sometime later, a good while later. And so this burial, this mourning, and all of this period of time that they spend here, we really don't know how long that is, but we do know Jacob was severely distressed over losing Rachel. And I'm not gonna try to make any application about that or make any assumption as to why Rachel died or whatever the case might have been. But we do see that he loses, his favorite person in all the world. And as a result of that, he mourns for a good while, and his sons and his daughters-in-law try to encourage him and help him through that mourning, but he wouldn't have it. He was just so upset that he could not be consoled. And so he mourned for her, and then after that, they moved on to the tower. And we have a location for the tower leader. All we know is it's somewhere between Bethel and where she and Everett, near to where Rachel would have been buried. But it is also at this time that Moses tells us of Reuben's folly with Bilhah. He committed fornication with Bilhah at this time, and word got back to his father. Now, not a lot of elaboration about that. We're going to see more detail about that when we move on toward the end of Jacob's life, when he begins to bless his sons, and he actually, skips the first three, Simeon and Levi, and places the blessing upon Judah of all people. But there's one thing that I wanted to mention when we get to talking about these sons. And the daughters of the people that they took for wife. We don't have a whole lot of detail about that except for Judah, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But instead of trying to find daughters that would have been, or wives that would have been more suitable for God, to God, and more suitable for righteousness, they chose daughters from land. And to be quite honest, up in this, there are people back in Haran were really starting to be given over to idolatry, because we see evidence of that from Laban and the way he lived his life and the teraphim that he had. There's been a lot said to try to explain that away, that all these were just, lucky charms or whatever. But even at that, that's not far from God. I mean, even a rabbit's foot can become an idol if you look at it like that. But nonetheless, we don't find Jacob's sons really choosing wives because of certain circumstances, especially in regard to Joseph, do they, and some of them do, and some of them do not. And so we'll continue that discussion a little bit later. All right, so after that, Jacob journeys on to Mamre to see his father Isaac, and he does arrive there and is able to be with him for a period of time. Anything about
Murphy. The son on our right hand signifies strength. It does. Yeah. Yeah. Favor and strength. Yeah. That's right. Good point.
So,
Is there any, indication of the kind of house that was built? I mean, when I think of a house, I don't think of something that they probably built back then. But did they, are there any archaeological or pictures or anything that, what kind of a house did he build?
Yeah, we don't know anything like that. As far as I know, there may have been excavation in that area that would tell us, but whether or not it would have been Jacob's has been awfully hard to identify, because most of the people during that period of time were people of agriculture and shepherds and that type of thing. One or the other would have been very difficult. Yeah, I don't know. It could very well have been just a tent, a temporary place. But, whatever they would have built, obviously, would have been sourced from, if they had built a solid structure, would have been sourced from the land. And so after a period of time, it would have, gone away. Also, time and weather and all of those things. So, it'd be hard to identify that kind of thing. But at the same time, that gives us a reminder of the wealth of Jacob. Houses, and he's built stalls for his animals, and he's just moved off and left. As far as we know, we don't know of anybody coming in and buying these places, or there's no agreement, when Abram went over there to Shechem's father Hamor. They made an agreement, and he, deeded him land and all of that. And, when he bought the oaks of Mamre, that was recorded. But we don't have any indication that was the case with Jacob. So, but still, I think that does really show that he was a wealthy man, and that he was able to build those things, and that was not something that he had to live off. He was wealthy enough that he could just move on. So that's an interesting point. Okay. So we learned that Isaac lives to an age of 180. Esau and Jacob buried him in the cave of Machpelah and Mamre. Now, it's not told us in this chapter that that's what occurred. But we do learn later on there's a recounting of that when Jacob buried Leah, and Jacob is buried there as well after he's brought up out of Egypt by Joseph's family. You know, in the Exodus, that they buried him there. And so we learned that all the ancestors are there except for Rachel. Yes, Bill.
They brought Jacob up out of Egypt, buried in his family too. Did they bury Joseph there also? Or they brought Joseph with them?
Yes, they did, and I believe that was the case. I can't say yea or nay, and I can't put my hands on the scripture at this point in time, but I feel sure that is the case because Jacob and Joseph most likely would have been buried at the same time. Their remains would have been buried at the same time there. So we will certainly get to that, and for some of you could look that up and give us the answer later on. Okay. The thing that I mentioned earlier that we didn't talk about in this, on Wednesday evening, I don't believe I brought that up, and that's specifically in Genesis 35 and verse 8. And this is another one of those seeming conundrums that we come across that Moses just throws out tidbits of information. And this one is about Deborah, who was Rachel's nurse. Rebecca's nurse. That she died and was buried below Bethel under the oak, and it was named Alan Backup. That means oak of weeping. Now, here is someone by the name of Deborah that we've not heard about before. Well, I take that back. Genesis chapter 24 may tell us that. Let me look at that real quick. Genesis 24, verse 59. This is back when Abraham's, Isaac's sends for, I'm sorry, I get it right in a minute. Abram sent his servant to procure a wife for Isaac. And so they sent her away, their sister Rebecca and her nurse with Abraham's servant and his men. So the assumption is that this is that same Deborah. We don't know that is the case. It may very well have been. Okay. Deborah would not necessarily have been a family member of Rebecca's. She was just a nurse or a servant that would have been assigned to her by Bethuel and Laban to take care of her and her family. And so she comes back there in Genesis 24. She comes from playing around with Rebecca and comes Canaan and went to Padan Aram and stayed there 20 years. And he's coming back to the land of Canaan now. How was it that is Moses just inserting some parenthetical information and telling us that this highly favored nurse of Rebekah's passed away? Moses really doesn't tell us either answer, does he? All he does is he inserts this information, kind of like Reuben's situation with Bilhah.
When Jacob came back to Isaac, I imagine Rachel was still there. I mean, Rebecca was still there. Did he stay with Isaac?
Yes, but
Communal type thing?
what we find is that this is before he gets baptized. See, what I've told the story, now I'm going back. Okay? What I should have done is I should have started with this, but I don't want to talk about it until we talk about Reuben and Bilhah. So in Genesis 35 verse 8, that event occurred before Jacob ever got back to Isaac's house, as far as we can tell. But again, Moses, and his custom is, and we're going to see that today, it's not necessarily chronological. Okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that Deborah died before Jacob got back. We think that's the case because of the way it's shown here. What we're trying to get us to see is that he is inserting this information about these characters. And in connection with Deborah, she doesn't have anything to do with the lineage of Christ. But it's important to know that this nurse that stayed with that family was beloved of this family. And they mourned over her and named the place where she was buried the Oak of Weeping. So that's really, I think, the point of all of that. Not that we need to find exactly, the chronology of the matter. And Moses will continue to do this as he talks about things throughout not only Genesis but other Deuteronomy. So I bring all this up and I make such a big deal about it to say don't make a big deal about it. So, but these things, these tidbits are important.
And what is the reason for that?
Brother Walton, Jeremy, on page 103 in his house, notes, he says, we have made the story of Joseph a separate heading in the period of the patriarchs because so much of the book of Genesis is devoted to his life, but he is not listed as one of the father rulers of the Israelites. The fathers of the Israelites were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Okay. All right. In chapter 38, we learn of Judah and Tamar. In the, equally important to what Murphy had to say, and it's bottom of page 100. It says, "Let us take this story out of order in which it is recorded in the Bible text to avoid interrupting the story of Joseph. It is a story about a son of Jacob, just as the story of Simeon and Levi, the story of Reuben, and the story of Joseph are about his sons. This story is much shorter than the story of Joseph, and it will fit well into the narrative here. The event, however, does not actually take place until long after Joseph was sold." So we're jumping ahead in time, in chronology. We're jumping ahead past the time Joseph was sold into slavery. Mind, Judah is a grown man with grown sons now. And so how many sons did Judah have at this time? It was Onan,
Erech,
and Shelah.
oh, Shelah.
Onan, and Shelah. So that's 3. Okay? Was the oldest. Judah finds and this is in chapter 38 again. It kind of struck me. The conduct of Judah and his sons in this chapter makes us wonder how it is that the Savior came from this lineage. But then you've got to think about Rahab.
Yes.
She was part of the lineage of Christ. And these are all people, just like us, who lived, who made decisions, some of them bad, some of them very consequential, and some of them good. From anybody. Is it any different from anybody that has ever lived? Scott?
Yeah, it's not about where we start, it's where we finish.
Right. That's right. Yeah, I've heard someone said one time that life is a lot like golf. It's not how you drive, it's how you arrive. And so when we come to the end of our lives, whenever that may be, we know not. But when we come to the end of our lives, we want to make sure that we're in good standing with God. And that's not to say that we put that off to the end. It's not to say that we follow in the steps of Judah. That's not to say we follow in the steps of Cain or or Onan. But that we do the best we can do every day to follow God. And so God often includes the wicked as well as the righteous in his plans. And we're going to learn, especially when the people of Israel come back into the land after the Exodus, that God is going to use people of the land to punish them severely from time to time because of their wickedness. Because they're supposed to be God's chosen people, but they're not acting like it. So, as you know, nonetheless, I just want to make that point and make some application in that direction. So Judah's eldest, married Tamar. What kind of person was Very wicked, wasn't he? What happened to
The Lord slew him.
The Lord slew him because of his wickedness. That's right. And so what? Childless, what situation does that leave Tamar in? She's a widow like any other woman, right? That loses her husband. Yet she does not have a child. Now, later on, statute in the law of Moses, but up until this point in time, it has been just a unspoken, I guess, rule among, maybe it was spoken, we really don't know, a rule to protect not necessarily the widow, but to protect her husband that had passed away, to raise up children to him. And so the second born then, Onan, his duty was to take Tamar to wife, to go into her and have children with her, and that first son would carry the name of the father that had passed away. It had belonged to Onan and Tamar. And so rather than do that, Onan, it seems, was happy to go in and have relations with Tamar, but he was not so happy to think about having a son or a child that would carry on his elder brother's name. So he didn't complete the task. Yes, Al?
Also, you got to consider the birthright. His brother's
Yes.
son would be first. His children get what was left.
Right, that's right. That subsequent blessing, if there was anything left at all. So he would not really, in this sense, not by his own a blessing, or his eldest son that belonged to him, which would actually be the second one, would not receive that blessing, as Alice pointed out. And so God saw the folly of that, and he slew Onan. Well, Judah, not wanting his youngest to be killed, raising some fine young men there, because he thinks, well, my youngest will do the same thing and God will kill him. And so Judah, not wanting his youngest to be killed, put Tamar off, said, you continue to live in your father's house as a widow. When Shelah is old enough, then Shelah will become your husband. He never intending, according to the scriptures, to give Shelah to Tamar. And so Tamar, as time went on, began to realize he's not going to keep his word. He's not going to give me his son, because he's afraid something's going to happen to him too. And so word came to Tamar that Judah had taken his sheep to the shearers. He was out there with the sheep, preparing to have them sheared, and she does what? She tricks him. That's right. She takes her widow's garments off, puts a veil on, dresses in such a way that would indicate to a man that she was a harlot. And so she sat there at the gate of the city, and Judah saw her, and Judah said, well, he came near to her and said, lie with me, and I will give you a lamb from the flock. And so she said, well, I don't have a place to put a lamb right now. Give me something. Or give me some, as we would say today, a deposit. And so he gave his signet ring, his cord, and that cord would have been some decoration that he would have worn over his robe, and his staff. And so he performed the deed, and he left, and he sent a servant back. And the servant with the ewe or the lamb or whatever it was, and he told the servant to take this to the harlot there in the city. What did the servant find? Nothing. That's right. She's not there. I asked the men of the city. There has been no prostitute here. And then later on, come to find out that she is with child. And so what, actually with children, twins, and as I mentioned, Judah had given her the signet ring, this cord, and this staff. And so when Judah found out that she was pregnant, what did he desire to do? Yeah, I'm just going to burn her. That's what they did to harlots at the time. If they were of your family, then they were not only to have done, but also to witness. But nonetheless, he sends for her, and so she comes in and says, well, you know, by the man that gave me these things, am I pregnant? And Judah says, well, I'm guilty. Tamar was more righteous than I in all of this, because I promised her that I would give her Shelah, and I did not do that. And so then is the story of Judah and Tamar, with the exception of the conclusion of that when the twin boys are born. It's a very interesting story there, isn't it? It kind of reminds me of Jacob and Esau. Scarlet thread and tie around his wrist so that we'll be able to keep them separate. We'll know who is who. We'll know who the firstborn is. And what was the importance of that? Bill?
The birthright.
Yeah, the firstborn was the one that received the lion's share of blessing, the birthright, and the father's blessing as well. For example, Jacob, Esau. And so instead of being born, Zerah pulls his hand back, and Perez is born first. And Perez means breach, right? And so the saying was that you have performed a breach for yourself. In other words, you have broken forth before the firstborn has. And so Perez was born first, and then Zerah after that. So that story, again, is something that is quite unusual. Just think back from the beginning of Genesis. We're now in the 37th, 38th chapter. Think back of the stories that we have learned and have been recorded by Moses for us to understand and to know that are so unusual. You start out with Eve in the garden who's tempted by Satan. And then Cain rises up and kills his brother Abel. And then there's a flood and only 8 souls are saved, and that's Noah and his household. And then there is incest. There is to be killed because the Lord told him to do that. Do you see how the providence of God is acting in all of this? And how God is showing us that even in extreme situations, we can still have faith in Him. He'll take care of us. How many of us would have wanted to take our firstborn son up on the mountain to kill him? The son of promise. I don't believe anybody would jump to that. Now, you know, perhaps we would have been in Cain's shoes. I don't know. I hope not. And here's Judah, taking his own daughter-in-law, although she tricked him into it. And then there's Rebekah, tricking her husband with Jacob. You see all of these, sometimes I refer to them as convoluted stories. You see what happened when sin came into the world? And do you see the need for the remedy of that? God has taken care of us. Even before we were born, even before man was created, He had the plan to take care of us. And so I'm trying better to look at these stories like Judah and Tamar and Cain and Abel and all of these other just terrible things that have happened, that I am quite capable of that myself if I'm not faithful. Scott?
Yeah, we see how God's hand is working throughout the beginning that leads us all the way to Christ, which was the plan you just mentioned. And then it's recorded so that after Christ's time, we have it today to look back upon and see. And so, blessed are those who have faith and did not see that. So,
Right.
so it's a master plan, is what it is.
It really is, and for God to be able to see the end from the beginning, and the wisdom and the care life. I mean, these things happen. We see something that happens today. Oh, it's a miracle, it's a miracle. No, it's unusual. It's not a miracle. But those things happen. And so I just want to take just a moment to stop and talk about that very thing so that we can think about that. Because sometimes as I am going through this information, I'm thinking, well, I've read this story since I was, 4 or 5 years old. And I know these stories, but what's the application of it? Billy, than that.
It shows that God never interfered with free will.
Right.
That's
He
right.
never interfered with free will. He let man do what he was going to do. But he had a remedy for it.
Yes. Al?
1 Corinthians 10 verse 11 says, now all of these things were written for our learning. Why did he put it in there? Because every one of us is subject to something like that.
That's right.
And God didn't reach down from heaven and burn them up on the spot. They continued to live their lives like their own.
Yes. That's right. That's right. And I think that we can owe that, obviously, to God. But those few men that decided that their house was going to be on the foundation of God and His will. And you've got Moses, and then you've got Joshua. He's telling the people, if you want to go back to Egypt, take off. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Murphy.
Piggybacking on Al, we talked about the fact that these people did wrong, free will. God didn't reach down and burn them up. There you see the mercy of God.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Grace and mercy. Okay, we're about out of time. We've got just a few minutes left, so we're going to hold chapter 37 until Wednesday night, Lord willing. Now remember, we'll do chapter 37 on Wednesday evening, and if we go further than that, we'll go to chapter 39 because we've already done 38. So just kind of follow the guideline of the workbook if you haven't already gotten that far. And remember that we'll skip over chapter 38 because we've just finished that this morning. Thank you so much for your time, your attention, and your comments.